Cuba has been going through a lot of shit in the pandemic. I've gone over this in some of my videos on Cuba about how Cuba became very reliant on the tourism industry over the last 20 years or so, 25 years or so. And the pandemic obviously has fucked over tourism, and also the pandemic in general has been quite bad there. Like, not the worst or anything, but it hasn't been great. And all of these, these two situations are coming together to basically fuck people over quite a lot. So what's been happening is, there's people are having to, there's, long lines to buy stuff from food markets, stuff like that. There's constant blackouts, just generally very bad stuff that obviously isn't being helped by the US embargo. And in Cuba, you generally have two camps of people, politically at least, in these sorts of situations. Now, these sorts of crises don't happen too often in Cuba, despite what people might think. The last time there was a crisis anywhere near this bad was in the 90s, like early 90s, during the special period, which I've also covered in the Cuba video of mine that I made on my main channel a while ago. So there's two sort of camps of thought in Cuba regarding these things. There's people who tend to blame these sorts of economic problems on the circumstances rather than the government, which I think, certainly has a lot of merit, obviously, because Cuba is also one of the most fucked over countries in the world. And obviously the pandemic is a huge fucking deal. And the collapse of the tourism industry has also been a massive deal. But at the same time, I'm sure there's things the government could have done differently. I haven't been following the situation that closely, but there's always things the government could do differently. There's no government is perfect, you know what I mean. And there's also another group which tends to blame the government directly for everything that happens while just completely ignoring any sort of external circumstances. And the second group has definitely been getting bigger in recent years. Ever since the special period, it's definitely been getting bigger. I still don't think it's like a majority at all. You can't call them gusanos, dude. It's natural to blame your government for stuff for bad shit that happens. Though people in Cuba are generally a lot more conscious of the reality of whatever situation they find themselves in than people in other countries are. But yeah, there's the dual currency thing as well is another thing. They recently abolished the dual currency system, which is a good thing. It's a good thing in the long term, but these sorts of changes always cause huge problems when you actually, these sorts of measures are temporary measures, and it hurts to get rid of them because they cause problems. Short-term problems that have to be fixed in the long term. Another great example of this is currency controls. For example, Venezuela's currency controls, in the first place, they definitely probably seemed like a good idea, right? To keep control of the price of food and stuff so that people could actually afford it. But in the long term, now they've backed themselves into a bit of a corner where the second they liberalize the exchange rate, everything's going to get even more fucked than it already is. So it's a bad situation, but it has to happen sometime, right? And for it to happen in the middle of a pandemic, I think that's probably a bit of a mistake. No, don't look at any SOS Cuba thing. Those are just reactionary hashtags that people woke liberal imperialists use to try to frame US foreign policy as progressive. So I made a thread on this on Twitter, just saying, yep, people have legitimate reasons to protest, absolutely. Now, obviously, there are dishonest actors in these protests. There's US-funded groups like the San Isidro group who kind of tried to latch on to legitimate complaints to turn them into attacks on the government, right? And obviously, overthrowing the government in the middle of a fucking pandemic isn't going to do you any good. Absolutely not. The Cuban government, yeah, it allows criticism. What it doesn't allow is people saying we need to overthrow our government, okay? Two different things. And in reality, most countries don't allow that. Part of the reason why the Cuban government cracks down on that stuff more than most Western governments do, and they do crack down a lot still in those Western places too, don't get me wrong, is because the threats there are way more realistic, right? If I post on Twitter saying I want to overthrow the US government, obviously that's not a realistic threat. If a group like San Isidro goes out funded by clandestine US sources and says, we want people to come into the street to overthrow the government, that is a far more realistic threat. So, obviously the state is going to react like it is a more realistic threat, because it is. But look, what I was trying to say here is that people in Cuba have legitimate reasons to protest. Things are fucked up. You really can't expect people not to protest in times like these. It was pretty much inevitable. There's 6-hour long blackouts almost every single day. People don't like having to line up for an hour to get food. But this is not what the situation is generally like, right? It's an exceptional situation. It's not nearly as bad as it has been in the past, but it still is a pretty bad moment, you know? And hopefully Cuba can get people all vaxxed up, sort of overcome this situation sooner rather than later. I don't think these protests are particularly going to result in, they're not. This is not going to result in regime change or anything. Another thing is that in Cuba, anti-government protesters or anti-government people in general, aside from the actual terrorists, they're not very violent, right? People in Cuba tend to be very patriotic. Like even the more honest opposition people tend to be more patriotic. There's very few of them. There are people who are like against the government in Cuba, who are against U.S. intervention and who want to keep all of the social structures and stuff. But there's always a much greater representation of like the U.S. funded bad actors who want to sort of take advantage of these protests for their own ends. And yeah, as someone in chat was saying, the Cuban police aren't going to react with like massive repression against this. They don't do that. Like non-lethal sort of riot control armaments are basically unknown in Cuba. They don't use them. There's not really much of a need for them. The Cuban president is currently walking in the street with pro-government protesters, okay? We're not talking about a situation like Venezuela at all. Maduro loves to shoot protesters. You can't deny it. Well, okay, he loves to shoot them more with non-lethal ammunition, but, he's not afraid to send the fucking military in against people, no matter what they're protesting about. He's not afraid to send, like the Venezuelan equivalent of the gendarmerie, I would call them. Not so much the military. You can't compare the two situations at all. The two countries are not even remotely the same in any real respect. Though I definitely am a little bit worried with the rhetoric of Miguel Diaz-Canel. I feel like he's getting a bit too... He definitely might have taken it a bit too far. Like, he made it sound like there's going to be fights in the streets or something, but I don't think he really believes that. I don't think he wants that to happen at all. So a bit much from him, but I mean, you don't see people walking unarmed through the streets like this in civilian attire if they are legitimately afraid that they're going to get lynched by the crowds, okay? Like, I think in general, this is a terrible time to be in government with the pandemic. Anywhere in the world, like, you would prefer to be opposition, right? In opposition right now, talking from like a purely like political clout standpoint, because it's a fucking global pandemic, right? It's so fucking easy to take advantage of everything that governments are doing to spin them negatively, even if they're not that bad. No, even in Vietnam and China, they're spinning them, dude. Like, oh, it's all about the terrible anti-freedom lockdowns, no matter how good they worked, right? But yeah, there's a reason these protests are happening now and not like 2 or 3 years ago. But yeah, I think there is a lot more trust in the government in Cuba. This is not a situation like Venezuela where the government has like 15% support. The Cuban government easily has like, I would say like at least 40 to 50% people who are just straight up, you could even just call them loyalists, basically, right? They still have popular legitimacy. It's a terrible situation, and hopefully it doesn't escalate. I don't think it will. It would be totally unprecedented for protests like this to escalate in Cuba. Totally unprecedented. So you look at this protest, right? This is near that's the sea. So this is like the Malecon, which is like near the Malecon, which is one of the main gathering places in Cuba, like the boardwalk. Now, ignoring the way they frame this, just look at the video, right? There's a lot of people protesting for sure, but it's not any bigger than the pro-government protests. Like, this is maybe like 200, 300 people in this video. Now, obviously, the fact that people are protesting is a pretty big deal in Cuba, regardless, right? People don't protest that much in Cuba. People tell you that it's because they're afraid of getting repressed, but it's much more that people in Cuba tend to have like much more politically conscious, and they tend to be able to differentiate like why things are happening, right? What are the actual numbers? I mean, we don't fucking know, man. You can't tell. All we can do is make a random judgment. I'd say there's probably like a couple of hundred people here, maybe like in the thousands, 2,000-3,000 across the island. Pro-government protests probably about the same. I don't think most people are really participating. But I mean, this could definitely escalate. Hopefully it doesn't. You know, if the people who think that the Cuban government is terrible and all that want to prove it, they should probably be against the embargo and all of the international attacks on Cuba, because then you could finally prove it. You know, if the government fails without that excuse, then you can finally prove it, you know? That's my pitch to those people. But yeah, so basically summary of the Cuban subject. People have legitimate reasons to protest, obviously. Is it a CIA cover revolution? No. There's certainly bad actors trying to take advantage of the situation who have links to the USA, like the San Isidro group I mentioned earlier. But, you know, people are in a fucking terrible situation, right? Things are not great right now in Cuba at all. And the government definitely needs to shift something up to try to better it and hopefully deal with these concerns.